All right, welcome to part two of the spatial inventory tutorial. So in the last one, we got it set up so that when you press the I key, it would show the inventory on the screen. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create items or a concept of items. So in this tutorial, we're going to be keeping the items pretty simple. So we're going to have an AK, a knife, and a grenade. And they're not going to have any functionality to them, like you're not going to be able to fire the AK, obviously, or throw any of the grenades, because that's obviously not the point of this tutorial. I have other tutorials on my channel for throwing grenades and shooting weapons, and there's plenty of other tutorials out there for this. But for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to make it so that the items can be equipped, moved around in your inventory, and dropped. So those are the three things, well, not equipped, but picked up and added to your inventory, moved around in your inventory, and dropped, because that's really what you need to be able to kind of test this system out. So with that being said, we need to create our items. So in order to do that, we need to actually have some items to use. So the ones I used are actually from the marketplace. I think they're free. Let me look at the name of what they are called. So yeah, it's called FPS Weapon Bundle. So if you don't already have this downloaded, you can find it on the marketplace tab, but just search for FPS Weapon Bundle. I think it's free. If it's not free, you're either going to have to buy it, or you can really use any weapons. It doesn't matter. Like, you can just use blocks if you want to. It doesn't really matter what you use. Um, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be using some of the weapons from this pack. So I'm going to add this to my project. And let me find my spatial inventory. So we'll select add to project, like so. And then that will go ahead and create us a FPS weapon bundle folder with the weapons in it. And then the other asset we're going to need is these icons. So if you look in the description of this video, I'll have a link to where you can download these icons if you are following along exactly with the tutorial, just so you can have them at your disclosure. But if you do decide to download these, then what we want to do is, well, actually, before we drag them in, let's create a folder for them. So I'm going to drag this off to the side real quick. So back in the content folder, let's make a new folder and call it items. And then inside of this folder, let's make one more folder and call it icons. And then go inside of the icons folder and then take your icons and drag them into the icons folder. All right. And so we need to modify these slightly. So with all of them selected, right click, go to asset actions, and go to bulk edit via property matrix. And what this will do is let us modify all of these settings at once. And we want to change under level of details, we want to change the texture group to be UI. And then under compression, we want to change the compression setting to be user interface. And we're doing this because they are images that are going to be used on the UI, and they need to have like the UI settings for them. So now if we save all and we close this, you can see that they have a nice transparent background and they look more like what we need them to look like. Okay, so let's see. So let's start creating our actual items. So if we come back here to the items folder, let's create our blueprints. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to try to explain it real quick because it's a little complicated, but items are essentially going to be broken down into two parts. So you're going to have the item itself, which is going to be an actor, and that is going to represent the actual visual state of the item. So, when the AK is laying on the ground, it will be of this type of actor. Or if you were to pick it up and hold it in your hands, you would be seeing the actor version of the item. But items will also have kind of another version to them, which is going to be called an item object. And the item object is going to be a U object, and it's not going to have any rendering associated with it. It's going to keep track of everything about the item that needs to persist when it's added to your inventory. Because if you think about it, if you pick up an AK or some other item and you add it to your inventory, you no longer want the AK to render. Like, you don't want to be able to see it. And in fact, it doesn't even need to be an actor anymore at that point. All we need to do is save information about it to tell the game that we have an AK. Maybe we can save how much ammo it has. Maybe we can save, whatever we need to persist about it when it's in our inventory. And then when we go to take it back out, it needs to know how to spawn the new actor. So that's the way I like to do items for inventories. I like to have an actor version of them, which is used when it's visually in the scene somewhere, and then an object version of it, which is used whenever it's in your inventory. So let's right click and create the blueprint class for the actor first. So we want to select actor and we will call this BP item. So this is going to be the base class for all of our items. And then like I was just saying, we also want to have an object version of that. So let's right click and go to user interface, or sorry, go to blueprint class. And then under all classes, we want to select object and hit select. And we will call this BP item object. So again, this is a very important distinction to make. The item is the actual visual representation of the actor, and the object is data about the object, essentially. And you'll see how these kind of work together once we start setting it up. All right, so now that we have this, we need to create our kind of example items. So I'm going to be creating an example AK, grenade, and knife. So they are all going to be childs of BP item. So if we right click on this, we can say create child blueprint, and then that will create a child of that blueprint, and we can call it BP underscore AK47. And then we can just duplicate this and call it BP underscore grenade, and then duplicate one more time and call it BP underscore, what's the last one, knife. All right, so let's open up our item first of all. So there isn't going to be a whole lot in here. It's going to be pretty straightforward. So we basically just want to add a static mesh to represent the item. So we'll add a static mesh. And then we also want to add a sphere collision. So add a sphere collision. And the sphere collision, let's drag it onto the static mesh so that it's parented to it, like so. And so the sphere collision will be used for detecting when we walk over top of an item so that we can pick it up. And then let's click on the static mesh real quick and change the collision preset to no collision because we don't want it to have any collision. And we want the sphere to be set to overlap all dynamics and make sure it is set to that. And then inside of here, we want to create our item object. So each item, which again is the visual representation, is going to hold on to a reference to the item object. So that way, when the item gets picked up, it can pass that object into the inventory, and the inventory can keep track of it while the actor deletes itself. So over here on the left, let's add a variable and call it item object. And we want this to be of type item object, obviously. So say item object. And then we want it to also be instance editable and expose on spawn, so that way we can set it when we spawn the object. And then we want it to be private so that nobody else can edit it. And we will go ahead and add this to a private category since it's private, just like that. And so now inside of begin play, what we want to do is we want to check if this item object is valid. And if it is valid, we don't really need to do anything. But if it's not valid, then we want to create a default one. And the reason we're doing that, it'll hopefully make more sense later, but the reason we're going to do that is because when let's say an AK is just laying on the ground somewhere, well, when begin play gets called, this isn't going to be set to anything, and so we need to create a default one. So that's one use case. But it's also possible that the AK is being removed from the inventory and placed on the ground, and in that case, the item object will be set when the new AK is created, and so we don't want to create a new one. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll try to explain it when we actually go to make use of it, but for right now, just drag this guy in and say is valid, and then we want to check if it's not valid, so we'll say not boolean, and we'll do a branch. So if it's not valid, we want to create a default one. So what I'm going to do is create a little function over here, and we'll call it get default item object. And this function will be overwritten by all the child classes so that they can create their own unique item objects depending on what type of item they are. And we can make this guy private, so let's set him to private and add him to a private category as well. And so what this function is going to do is simply return to us an item object. So on the outputs pin, let's add a return value and make it of type BP item object, and we will call this the item object. Now, we're going to leave this function empty right here because, again, this BP item is the parent class, so we don't actually expect this to be called. We want the children to override this function as needed. So we can come back here to our begin play, and we can call our get default item object. And whatever this returns, we want to set our item object to. So we'll set it. And then we will go inside of each child class and fill out this function here very shortly. But before we do that, let's just add the code for picking up an item because it's pretty straightforward. So we can delete all this. So what we want to say is whenever this sphere is overlapped with, we want to pick up the item. So we can right click on the sphere, add event, and add the on component begin overlap. And what we will do is we will cast the other actor to a third person character. So this is basically just checking if it is our player character. So if it is, then what we want to do is we want to get his inventory component and we want to add ourselves to it. So we can say get inventory component. And so we're going to need to write a function in here that adds an item because we don't actually have that yet. So let's real quickly go and write that function, or just at least create the function, and then we'll come back and finish writing this. So let's go to our inventory component. And let me go to my other monitor as well so I don't mess this up. Okay, so over here on the left, we want to add a function. And we are going to call this, we're actually going to call this try add item. And the reason we're calling it try add item is because it's going to essentially try to add the item to the inventory, but it might fail if the item doesn't fit. Like if there's no available room for the item, it might fail. So that's why we're calling it try add item. So because it's called try add item, it's going to return to us a boolean on whether or not it succeeded. So we're going to add an output pin, and we will just call this added. And then we also want to add some input pins. So we want to take in obviously the item we're trying to add. So in this case, we're going to be taking in an item object and not an item because, again, just trying to explain this as best I can. The item object is the data associated with the item. And when the item gets added to the inventory, we're adding the item object to the inventory. We're not adding the actual item because the item is like the visual representation of it, which obviously we don't want that when it's inside the inventory. So we're going to add an item object. We'll call this the item object. And then we also want to add, actually, I think that's all we need to add. Yeah, so we're just going to add the item object. We'll come back and fill this out here in a second. I just want to finish where we were before. So now we have this triad item added. So we can come back here to our BP item, and we can say try add item. And so the item we want to add is obviously our item object. And so we want to check the return value. So we'll do a branch to see if it actually was added. And if it was added, then we want to destroy ourselves. So we'll say destroy actor. So just to kind of re-explain this again, because I think this is very important to understand. Whenever the visual representation of the item, so like the AK on the ground, whenever that gets overlapped with, we try to add our item object to the player's inventory. And if we succeed in doing so, then we actually want to delete ourselves because we want to delete the visual representation of the item. But again, we've added our item object to the inventory, so that will persist inside of our inventory, but the actual visual representation of the object or the item will get destroyed, which is exactly what we want. And obviously, if it fails, we just want to do nothing because there's no room. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this try add item function. So inside of here, the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the item that's being passed to us is valid, because obviously if they pass to us an invalid item, we just kind of want to get out of here. So we'll say is valid and hook that up like so. And what we want to do is we want to essentially figure out where this item can be added. So in order to do that, the way this inventory component is going to work is it's going to contain an array of item objects, and that array of item objects is going to correspond one-to-one with the grid. So let's add a variable over here, and we will call it items. And we want to change the type of it to be item object. And we want to change the we want to change this to be an array, because this is an array of item objects. So if you think about our grid here, let me just run this. So if you think about our grid here, you'll see it has like, well, it's basically just an array, right? So this items variable that we just added is going to be an array, and it's going to have an entry for each one of these tiles inside of the grid. So it's going to map one-to-one with this, with the inventory grid. And the items inside of that grid are going to point to whatever item is currently inside of that tile, if that makes sense. So what we want to do is we want to loop over this and try to find an available spot for it. So we'll say for each loop. So we're essentially looping over the tiles right now and trying to figure out, like, is there something currently inside of this tile? So to do that, we're going to make another little function here that's going to help us out. And it's going to be called isRoomAvailable, because just because the individual tile is available doesn't necessarily mean that there's enough room for the item, because the item probably is going to take up more than one tile. So we want to loop over each tile and then check if that tile has enough room around it to hold whatever item's being added. So over here on the left, let's add a new function just to keep things kind of organized, and we'll call it isRoomAvailable. And inside of here, we want to add an input pin for the item, of course. So we'll say item object. And then, oh, let me fix one thing on my other monitor. Okay. And then we also want to add the index of where we're trying to add it at. So we'll add a new parameter, and we will call it, or we'll make it of type integer, and we will call this the top left index. So this is essentially the top left tile of where we want to add the item at. And so what we want to do inside of here is, let's just make a sequence node, and then, because we're going to be doing a couple things. The first thing we want to do is we want to loop over each index inside, or loop over each index that the tile would, sorry, it's kind of complicated. We want to loop over each tile that the item would occupy if it was added to the inventory at this top left index. So for example, just so you have an idea of what's going on, and it's not super crazy. Let me run my other project here real quick, except I broke it. Hold on, give me 1 second. Okay, so if we run this, you can see when I go to pick up this AK, you can see it's going to try to add it to this top left corner. But before it does that, it's going to call isRoomAvailable to check if it is added to this top left corner, is the room available like in all of these tiles? Because it really takes up like all of these tiles, right? So when I pick it up, it checked each one of these tiles to make sure that the tile was free. And so what we need to do is we need to loop over each of these tiles that it's going to occupy and make sure that they are valid. So that's kind of what we're doing right now. So we want to drag in, or we want to get this top left index, and we basically want to loop over all of these tiles. So in order to do that, I'm going to make a little handy macro here that's called for each index. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in an item, and it's going to take in the top left corner, and it's going to loop over every index that that item would occupy. So I know, bear with me, this is a little confusing, but, well, it's just confusing. So we need to add an item object, and this will be called our item object. And then we want to take in the top left index again, and call it top left index. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit confusing, but it's basically just some simple math. So in order to do this, we want to take this top left index, and we want to convert it to a tile, because the indexes in this array go from 0 to however many tiles there are, but we need to convert this index, which is, again, just 0 through n, to a XY location on the grid. And so to do that, we're just going to make a handy little function. I know we're just making functions inside of functions inside of functions right now, but I promise there will be an end to this tunnel at some point. So let's add a function. I'm just trying to keep things as organized as possible. And if there weren't a bunch of functions, well, it would just be chaos. So we're going to make a function called index to tile. And we want to take this and we want to add it to a public category, which already is. Oh, why do I not have this set? So these should all be public, sorry. Add these all to a public category, because these are all public functions, like so. Okay, so try add item. So let's go inside of here. Oops, sorry. Index to tile, rather. Let's go inside of here, And what this is going to do is, just like I said, it's going to convert an index to a tile. So we need to take in an index. We will call this index. Okay, so we want to convert this from a 0 through n to an x and a y coordinate. So to do that, it's pretty straightforward. We want to mod, so we'll say mod by the number of columns, and then we want to divide by the number of columns. So divide, integer divided by integer. And so this top one here, the modulus operator, is going to give us the x, and this is going to give us the y. So we can just drag this over here. That'll give us an output pin, and we will call this x. Oh, actually, let's return, instead of returning an integer, let's delete that. Let's return a tile, because we have a tile structure. So let's return a tile, and then we will call this tile, and then we will split this, and we will say tile x and tile y. So again, this is just converting a number from 0 to n, which represents the index into this array, into an actual x and a y coordinate for the grid. Yes, okay. So now we have that, we can come back to our for each loop, and we can get a little bit further at least. So we want to take this and we want to call our index to tile. Oh, I forgot to make it pure. So just select this guy and make it pure so that we don't have to have that annoying thing, and make it constant as well since it's constant. Okay, so tile to index, and we want to also drag off of this guy, and we want to get the dimensions, which I think we maybe didn't write that function either, but it's pretty straightforward. No, we did not. Okay, so we need to write that function as well. Go back to the item object. So yeah, again, sorry I'm going back and forth so much. I will definitely recap this once we get it all finished, but there's just really no great way to do this because everything just overlaps with everything else. So let me open this up. So inside of here, we want to add, for right now at least, a variable that represents the dimensions of the object. So the item object is going to keep track of the actual size of it inside of the grid, or like how big it's supposed to be inside of the grid. So let's just add a variable and call it dimensions. And we will set this to be of type int point. So int point. I know that kind of seems like a weird type, but it's basically just an x and a y value as integers. And then we want to set this to all of these checkboxes, so it's exposed on spawn and all that good stuff. And then we want to basically add a function here, a public function to get the dimensions. So we'll add a function and we'll say get dimensions. And then all we want to do in this function, well, okay, so let's set it to pure and const and add it to a public category first of all. We just want to drag in our dimensions, and we want to return it like so. Right, and so now we can come back here to our BP item, or where were we? Our inventory component rather, and we can say get dimensions. And so we want to take, let me just move this output up here for now. So we want to take this tile and we want to split it. And we want to do a for loop, so we'll say for loop and hook this guy up. So we're actually going to drag this guy over here, and then let's bring him up top, the execute pin up top. And so we want to loop over the tile x's, and then we want to say plus, so we'll do integer plus integer, and we want to add to that the dimension -1. So oops, didn't mean to do that. So we want to split this guy, and then we'll say minus integer minus integer for the last index. And then after that, we want to do another for loop so that we can loop over the, so we looped over the horizontal, we want to loop over the vertical. So we'll say for loop again. And then for this first index, we want to pass in the tile y. So we'll drag in the tile y for the first index. And let me just drag this around, something like that. And then for the last index, we want to do this value, except we want to do int plus int, oops, not that, int plus int, wait, what? Int, oh, int plus integer, there it is. I couldn't see it for some reason. And to this, we want to add the dimensions y minus 1, so I'm just going to copy this and paste it there. This is going to be our dimensions y minus 1, so we want to hook that up to there. And then this is going to go into our last index. So we're basically just looping over all of the indexes that this tile will represent. And then our output parameter, so let's add a output parameter to this guy. So let's select this, and then on outputs, we want to add an execution pin. Actually, let me just move this guy over, and we'll just drag right out into it. So that's going to be our loop body. And we also want to drag our completed. And then we also want to return the tile. So add a node, bring it up to the middle here, and make sure you have it set to type tile, and we will call this tile. And we just want to split this guy. So the x value is going to be the value of our first loop. So drag this over, and I'm just going to make this a little neater. And then the y value is going to be our index of our second loop. Okay, so again, just to kind of recap, because I know that's just kind of a little bit confusing. So we get the index of the tile, and then we get the dimensions. And so we want to start at tile x, and we want to go to the number of dimensions minus 1, so basically all the way to the end. And that is our first loop. And then our second loop is going to start at our tile y and go all the way to the end of our dimension y minus 1. And then that is all going to get outputted. So it's going to output each tile basically. So now if we come back to our is room available, where is this? There it is room available. Then what we can do here is we can say, or we can just drag this guy in even. So for each index, and we can hook up our item object, and we can hook up our top left index, like so. And so what we want to know is, first of all, is the tile valid? So we can also make a handy little macro for that because it's pretty straightforward. So we'll make a macro. We'll call it is tile valid. And so basically a tile is valid if the x and the y are both greater than 0, and if the x and the y are both greater than the columns and the rows respectively. So we can just take in a tile, so add an input pin for a tile, and we can split this into the x and the y, and then we can say int greater than equal to 0, and I'm going to copy this, oops, copy. So we want to check if the x and the y are both greater than 0, and we'll say and boolean. And then we also want to make sure that the x and the y are less than the number of columns and rows so that it doesn't go beyond the end of it. And so we will say int less than, and we will take in the x and do this again and take in the y. And it's really important that you have the correct nodes here. Make sure you're using greater than or equal and greater than or equal, and then less than down here. And then I'm going to add 2 more pins to our and node and hook these guys up. And then we will do a branch off of this, and we will hook up the true and the false. And then we just need to hook up the rest of it. So let's just drag this guy over here to the input, and then move the execution pin up to the top so it looks a little neater. And there we go. So now we have a handy little macro that tells us whether or not a tile is valid, which is the first thing we need to check. So back here in our is room available, we can say is tile valid, and we can hook this up to our for each index loop. So if it's not valid, then we just want to go ahead and return false. So did we already add a return value? No, we didn't. So click on the is room available. I'm going to add an output pin and make it a Boolean type, and it will be called just result is fine. So we want to return false in a lot of cases. So basically the way this is going to work is like it's only going to return true if it gets past everything. So inside of this sequence, we're going to return true. But multiple points along this chain, we're going to return false if it fails. So return true on the sequence, and then we're going to copy this and paste it. And we're going to return false here because this is one case where we're like, no, there's definitely not enough room because, again, what we're doing here is we're looping over all the tiles. So if one of the tiles that the item is going to occupy is not valid, meaning like it's out of bounds of the array, then we can safely say that there's not room at this specific tile to add this item. So we can just go ahead and return false. But if the tile is valid, then what we want to do is we want to check if there's already an item at that tile. So in order to do that, we need to write a function that checks or that gets the item at the specified index. So over here on the left, we're going to add another function, and it's going to be called get item at index. And we can actually make this one private because nobody else is going to need access to this. So we'll make it private, and we will add it to a private category. And so what this is going to do, it's going to take in an index, obviously. So let's take in a index. And so this is, of course, an index into this array right here. And we want to drag in this array, and we just want to say is valid index, which is going to return true or false, depending on if the index is valid. And so we'll do a branch. So obviously, if the index is not valid, then we basically want to return nothing because, well, that's probably not good. So let's add some outputs here. We're going to output a boolean for whether or not it is valid at all. And we're also going to add an output for the item object, assuming it found it. So add an item object, and we will call it item object. So again, if the index that was passed in is just totally not valid, we're just going to return valid as false, and we're going to return an empty item object. So we can just leave it like this. But if it's true, then what we want to do is we want to look inside of our items array and find the item at that index. So drag in items, and we will say get. And the index is obviously the index that's passed in. So get index, which again is just this guy that's being passed in. And we want to return that value. So I'm going to copy this return node, paste it. And we want to return true because we found it. And then we want to return the item. Now there might not actually be an item there. Like the item, it might just be empty because this array is essentially always going to be the same size. It's going to be the size of our grid. And so when the game first starts and there's nothing in your inventory, this is just going to be an array that's populated with a bunch of items that are not set to anything. So it's very possible that this returns an item that's just not set to anything, which is totally fine because that indicates that there's an available slot there, basically. Okay, so now that we have this function, again, we can come back to our is room available and we can keep writing it. So let's see. So we want to say get item at index, and we want to check the item at the index of this tile. But now, unfortunately, this is a tile and not an index. So just like we did before where we had index to tile, we need to write another function that converts a tile back to an index. So it's basically just going to be the opposite of tile or index to tile. So let's just add a function real quick, and we will call it tile to index. And let's drag it into the public category and then set it to, or it already is set to public, so we want to set it to pure and const. And so inside of here, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We just obviously want to take in a tile. So we'll take in a tile, and we will call it tile. And then we want to output an index. So we will output an integer and call it index. All right, so to convert it, we kind of basically want to do the opposite of what we did before. So we're going to take this and we're going to break it into the x and the y. And so to get the index, it's going to be the x plus, so we'll say int plus integer, plus the y times the number of columns. So we'll say int times integer, and we want to drag in the columns and hook that up. And so that is going to be our index, like so. All right, and so now back here in is room available, we can drag off of our tile. I'm going to add a little reroute node here, and we will say tile to index so we can convert back. Oops. Just move this around so it's not so cluttered. All right, so tile to index, And so we're checking now if the tile or if the item at this specific index is set to anything already. So we can say is valid. So if it's not valid, obviously we want to return false. So let's copy and paste, return false. But if it is valid, then what we want to do is we want to check if the item that it found there is actually set to something. So we'll say is valid. And again, I'll recap this here in a second, but we're almost done. So we'll say branch. So if it is valid, then we can go ahead and return false as well, because we know that it's already set to something. So copy and paste. Okay, so that is the function. I know it was a lot, so let's go ahead and just kind of recap exactly what it's doing, because it's really not that complicated when you read through it. So this function checks if the room is available for this item at this top left index. And so what we're doing here is we are looping over all of the tiles inside of the inventory that this item would occupy if it were to be added at this top left index. And so for each one of those tiles, we are checking, is the tile valid, meaning is it actually inside of the grid? So obviously if it's not a valid tile, we're just going to return false and say that there's no room available. But if it is a valid tile, then we are basically converting that tile to an index and checking if the item at that index is valid. So if the inventory is completely empty, then it's going to, well, assuming that it returns true, so assuming that the index is actually valid, which it should be, because there's really no reason we'd be given an invalid index. But if the inventory is completely empty, we're basically getting the item at that specific tile, and since it's empty, then is valid is going to return false, because it's just going to be an array of empty actors, basically, or empty items, basically. And so it's going to return false, and so since it returns false, if it's valid, then, or, so if it is, sorry, so if the item object is valid, meaning there is already something there, then we want to return false to say that there's no room available. But if it's not valid, then it's going to go this direction. And if you remember all the way back here at the start, we have a sequence node. So if it gets all the way to the end and it doesn't return false on any of the other returns, it's going to return true. So basically, if it gets past all of this stuff, it returns true to say, yes, there's room available. Okay, so hopefully that made sense, or at least some degree of sense. So back here in try add item, we can keep writing this now that we have is room available. So when we try to add an item, we first check that the item is valid, and then we loop over our array, and we want to say, is room available? And we can just hook up our pins. So our array index is going to be the array index of the loop, and our item object is going to be the item object that's passed in. So we'll say get item object, like so. Something like that. And so if room is available, this will return true, so we can do a little branch here. So if room is available, then we want to go ahead and we actually want to add the item at that specific index. So again, we're going to make another function for actually adding the item once we are 100% confident that there's room for it. So we'll add a function here, and we'll call it add item at, and we are dragging this into the private category and make it private. And so again, what this function does is it assumes that the item is going to fit. So you don't want to call this function if the item isn't going to fit. It assumes the item is going to fit, and it adds it to the inventory. So to do that, obviously we need to take in the item that we're going to add. So let's add an item object, and we will call this item object. And then we want to take in the top left corner again. So integer and top left index. And so we want to use our handy dandy little for each index again. So we're looping over each tile that this item is going to occupy inside of our inventory. Why is this? Oh, this needs to be a BP item object, sorry, BP item object. And so we want to hook up this, and we want to hook up that. And so for each index or each tile in the grid or in the inventory that it's going to occupy, we want to set the corresponding item inside of our array to be that item object. So we can use our items, drag this in, and we want to say set array element. So we're setting the array element at the index. So in order to get the index, we can again just say tile to index, and that's going to be our index. And then our item is going to be obviously the item that was passed in. So we'll say get item object, like so. Just making sure I didn't mess anything up. That looks correct. And then when it's completed, we basically want to set a flag to tell the system that the inventory has changed and it needs to update. And we'll be making use of this flag later, but for right now, let's just add it because it's really simple. So we're going to add a variable and we'll call it is dirty. So basically what is dirty kind of means is that it means that something has changed basically. So the state of it is dirty. It's kind of like basically just a flag to say something's changed. And again, we'll make use of this later, but for now, let's just set it to a bool and set it to single type. And actually, both of these should probably be in private categories. So for is dirty, let's make this private and add it to a private category. And then let's drag our items, set it to private as well, and drag it onto private, just like so. All right. Oh yeah, so when it completes, we want to set is dirty to true. And again, I'll explain why we're doing this later, but we just want to basically save the fact that something has changed inside of our inventory because we've added something to it. Okay, and so now back here in our try add item, we can say if there is room available, we can call add item at. And so the item we are adding is again our item object. Get item object. The top left corner is going to be this array index. So let me just drag this down and then hook that up like so. And then we can return true, just like so. And let me just look at my other project because I do some other stuff in here for rotation, but I don't think I want to cover that yet. I want to save that to the end. Yeah, okay, so I think that's all we need to do. So let me just recap this function here because I know we kind of gone in and out a few times. So try add item takes in the item that we're trying to add to the inventory. It then checks if it's valid to make sure, obviously, that it's valid because there's no point of adding an invalid item to our inventory. If it is valid, then we loop over each item in our item array. So we start at the top left corner, and we go across, and then we go down and across, and all the way until we get to the bottom right corner. And for each one of those tiles inside of our inventory, we check if that tile has enough room around it to contain the item that we're trying to add. And when we find one that does, then this branch will return true, and we will add the item. We will add the item at that specified index, and then we will return false. We will return true to signify that it was added. And so the last thing we need to do here is we need to return false if it gets through all of the items and it never finds a place for it. So if we just copy this return node and put it down here, we want to return false this time. So if it finishes the whole loop, it gets through all of our items, and it can't find any place, then we basically just want it to return false. Okay, so we can now add items to our inventory, which is pretty great. So if we come back here to our, where were we even before this? I don't remember. Were we here? No. Oh, we were inside of the character, right? Okay, so, or no, we were inside of the item. That's where we were. Yes. So inside of the item. So when we overlap, we cast to the character, and then we call our try add item, which we just wrote all that function, all those other subfunctions. And so if the item gets added, then we return, or we destroy the actor. So let's try to actually test this to some degree here. So let's make our AK item real quick. So if we go back, oh, actually one thing I totally forgot that we need to do. Inside of our inventory component, let's go to the begin play. So before we can really do anything, we need to set the size of this array to be whatever size of our inventory is. And we need to do that in begin play, or otherwise we'll get some crashes here. So let's take this guy and we want to resize it. And so the size that we want it to be is going to be the number of columns times the number of rows, because that's basically how many tiles there are. So we'll say columns, integer times integer, and we'll pass in rows, and that will be our new size. And then, yes, I think that's all we want to do right now. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So yeah, so let's make the AK and actually get that set up so we can kind of start to test things to some degree here. So if we go back to our content folder and we open up the AK-47, let me open up my other projects. So this is going to be pretty simple. There's really not a whole lot that's going to be inside of these items. But the main thing we want to do is we want to take this static mesh and we want to change it to our AK-47. Of course, it's not called that. What is it called? It is called KA-47 apparently. KA-47X. So that's the one I'm going to use. So now we can see our AK. And then back here in our function overrides, we need to override that get default item object function that we created earlier in the base class. So let's select this guy. And so what we want to do here is we don't want to call the parent function, so we can get rid of that. We want to construct the item object that's associated with this AK. So we'll say construct object from class, and we will hook this up. And so the object type we want to create is of type BP item object, just like that. And then, oh, we're going to need to fill this out first as well. Okay, so we need to fill out a few things in here in order to get some parameters to show up. So let's click on this little magnifying glass and open up the item object. So inside of here on the left, we already have the dimensions added, which is good, but we also need to add a couple more variables for like the texture it's going to show and the class that it represents and a couple other things. So under variables, create a new one, and we will call this the icon. And then we need to set the icon to be a type of material interface, I think, because we're actually going to end up using materials for the icon. So we want to select material interface. And then we want to set this to all of these checkboxes as well. And then we can actually duplicate this, and we will call this the icon rotated, because we're going to have one icon for when it's not rotated and one icon for when it is rotated. And then the final thing we want to add here is the class that this item object represents. So if we create a variable again, and we will call it item class, and we want to change this to be of type BP item, except we want to choose class reference. If you've never used a class reference before, it's basically just instead of a variable that's referencing something, it's a variable that's kind of like referencing a class. So when you go to create an object, you can provide a class for what type you want to create, and so that's kind of what this is. So it's basically storing, in this case for the AK, it's storing that this item object represents an AK. And so when we go to drop this item from our inventory, for example, we're going to look at this class variable and say, okay, what type of actor object do I need to create? And it's going to create whatever variable or whatever this class reference is set to. So select class reference, and again, make sure all of these are selected for all of these different variables. And I think we'll also add the rotated boolean for right now, even though we're not going to do anything with it. So add one more variable and call it rotated. For this one, we don't want any of these checked. We just want to set it to a boolean. Actually, we want it to be private, and we want to add it to the private category as well. Okay, so now that we have all of these exposed on spawn, we can actually create this correctly. So if we go back to our AK-47 and we refresh, you can see now we have something more akin to what we're looking for. So we need to fill all these out. So the outer is going to be ourselves. So we'll say get self reference. The dimensions is going to be basically whatever you want the dimensions for this item to be. And if you right click and you split this, you can set it yourself. So I think for the AK, I used 8x3. I'm just going to set it to something like smaller right now, just so we can test. I'm going to set it to 4x1, and again, we'll change this later, but I just want it to be able to fit correctly now without having to rotate, since we haven't written the rotation code yet. So I'm going to set it to 4x1 right now. The icon, we still need to do that part. Again, I told you there's like a billion parts to this tutorial, but we still need to do that part. We still need to create the icons. It's not that hard. I guess we can do that now. Let's fill out the item class real quick. Let's set this to BP AK-47. So we're basically telling it that go ahead and create the AK-47 whenever this item's dropped. Okay, so yeah, let's actually create the icons now because, why the heck not? So let's go back to the content folder. Let's go inside of icons. And then inside of here, we need to create materials for these items or for these textures. And the reason we're using materials is I tried for like 2 days to not use materials to like actually rotate these textures themselves whenever they're rotated in the inventory, but it caused so many problems with the drag and drop in system that we're going to be writing later. Like whenever you have a texture or something that's rotated and then you use the drag and drop operation, like the engine just freaks out and it can't handle it and the offset's all wrong. I tried for so long to figure out how to do it, but eventually I was just like, screw it, I'm just going to make materials that rotate the image, and it worked a lot better. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a material that can both render the texture and then also support rotation of the texture, and then we're going to create material instances off that material for all the different states of the items. And that's actually a pretty good solution because the material instances are just referencing one material. So even though we have a bunch of material instances, it's really only using one material behind the scenes, so it's not it's not a high hit on performance or anything like that. So let's just right click and create a material, and we will call it m underscore icon base. And so inside of here, again, we want to do two things. We want to sample a texture and we want to add the rotation. So if you right click and say texture sample, and then we want to take this and we want to convert it to a parameter, and then we will just call it the texture. So this is going to be a parameter for the texture we want to use. By default here, I'm just going to set it to the AK-47 just so we can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so one thing we need to do is we need to select this guy over here on the right, and we need to change it to user interface since we're going to be using this on the UI. And then we want to change the blend mode to be translucent since the icons obviously have some transparency to them. And so for the final color, we want to set up the RGB, and for the opacity, we want to pass in the A. And so there we go. So now we have our texture being rendered. But again, we want to do the rotation. So for that, we're just going to use this handy little custom rotator node. And so the rotation values are going to go into the UV coordinates. And so for the UV coordinates of this, we just want to use the text coordinates. So just search for the texture coordinate and hook that up. The center for the rotation, we want it to be the center of the image, which is 0.5, 0.5. So if you hold down 2 on the keyboard and left click, it will create a constant 2 vector, and we can hook that up. And then we just want to set this to 0.5 and 0.5. And then for the rotation value, it's going to be an angle between 0 and 1. So if we hold down 1 on the keyboard and left click, it will create a constant 1. And we can set the value to whatever we want. So the value that we want here is either going to be 0, which you can see makes it not rotate at all, or negative 0.25, which rotates it 90 degrees. Don't really know why that's the case, but that's just the way it works. And so negative 0.25 degrees. So again, we want to make this a parameter so that we can change this optionally, because sometimes we want it rotated, but sometimes we don't. So we're going to right click on this and say convert to parameter, and we will call this the rotation angle, I guess, even though it's not really an angle, but close enough. So if we look at our parameter default now, you can see we have 2 parameters, one for the texture and one for the rotation angle. I'm going to default this guy to 0, just so it's by default not rotated. And then we can hit apply and save. So this is going to be the base material that all of our icons are going to use. So in order to do that, we can create material instances for each one of these guys. So if we right click on this, we can say create material instance, and we will call this m underscore icon underscore AK-47. And so if we open this guy up, you can see we have our texture parameters over here. And so we can select this guy and make it true. And then we already have it set to the AK-47 because that's the one we chose as the base. So we don't actually need to change this. But if you didn't select that, make sure you have AK-47 set here. And then for the rotation angle, we can just leave it as 0 because, well, we want it to be 0. And then we will duplicate this. And we will say m underscore icon underscore grenade. And so for this one, we just want to change this to be the grenade, like so. And we want to do one more for the knife, so duplicate and say m_icon knife. And then for this one, we want to set it to our knife, like so. And so these are all of our unrotated material instances. And so if we just take all these and duplicate them, we can make the rotated versions of them. So I'm going to change all these to be _r at the end for rotated. And then all we have to do is open this up, check the rotate angle, and set it to -0.25. And then it will be rotated, just like so. And then we can do the same thing for the grenade. So I'm going to rename it to _r. Open this up, check this checkbox, and set it to -0.25. Oops, -0.25, like so. And then finally for the knife, we can do the same thing. Set to -0.25. I think I forgot to rename it. Yes, we want to rename this to _r. All right, so just kind of recap, we have our base material here, which is used by all of these material instances. So they're really all just referencing this one material, which is pretty great. And we have 2 different material instances per icon, one that ends in _r and one that does not. And then the one that ends in _r is rotated 90 degrees, basically. So those are all of our material instances. So now if we come back here to our AK, we can select for our icon, we can select our m_icon _AK47. And then we want to select the rotated one for this one. So we'll say m_icon _AK47, except we want to select _r. And there we go. So now our item object is completely created, and we just want to make sure that we hook it up to the return value. So make sure you drag this into the return value, like so. All right, now I honestly don't even know where we left off anywhere, so let's think for a second. So we have our third person character, and no, we don't want to look there. We want to look inside of our BP item. So we overlap with something, we make sure it's the player, and then we try to add the item to the inventory. And then if that succeeds, then we destroy the actor. So I think if we run this right now, nothing will really work. Oh, let me drag in an item into the scene real quick. Let me drag in my AK. Okay, so if I run this right now, I think it will pick up the AK, but I don't think it will show yet. And maybe it just won't do anything yet. Let's see why that's the case. Let's go to our BP item. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. You don't have to do this. I'm just debugging to figure out why this isn't working yet, because I honestly have no idea right now. So let me just check. Try add item. Okay, so that returned false for some reason. Let me just double check why. Try add item. Probably just forgot to do something stupid somewhere. So it loops over, is room available. So that's returning false for some reason when it definitely shouldn't. So let's put a breakpoint here. Sorry about this, but this is kind of a rather complicated tutorial, so I am not surprised I messed something up. Is room available? Top left corner for each index. Is the tile valid? Oh, why? That doesn't seem right. Let's double check this. Oh, right, because we didn't, you guys probably saw this and yelled at me when I did it, but so for this part right here, we want this to be set to columns, I believe, and we want this to be set to rows. Let me just double check real quick on my other project. What function is this? Is tile valid? Yeah, so this should be columns and this should be rows. So sorry about that. Let's try this again. So I'm going to pick up this item. Is room available? Okay, now it returned true. So let's see what it does now. Okay, so it did what I expected it to do. It picked up the item, but it doesn't actually display inside of the inventory yet because, well, we haven't written the code to do that. But we can now at least pick up items. And I even imagine, so let's see here, if we add a bunch of AKs, so I'm going to, or actually let's just change the size of this. So if we come over here to our BP AK and we change it to like 15 on the X, it probably won't let us pick it up anymore. So you can see it's not letting it pick us up, and that's because it knows that it doesn't fit inside of the inventory, because obviously 15 is too large. Okay, so it seems to be working behind the scenes. We just need to make it so that we can actually see what's going on. And so I think I'll do that in part 3, because this part's obviously probably pretty long already. So I will see you guys in part 3.